The ink on the settlement papers hadn't even dried when Ilse Varick stepped into the room like she owned the very air everyone was breathing. Outside, a hard autumn wind rattled the tall windows of the estate, and the scent of polished mahogany and imported lilies hung thick enough to choke on. Nor Kestrel looked down at the papers on the desk, saw her signature beside her husband's, and felt the baby shift inside her, as if the small body already understood that something had just broken beyond repair. Her son, Milo, 4 years old, clutched the hem of Nor's cardigan, watching the adults with a seriousness no child that age should carry. Theo stood near the fireplace, pale, unable to meet Nor's eyes, as though looking at her now would force him to admit what he'd done. Ilse crossed to the desk, lifted her chin, and smiled without warmth, the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent a lifetime winning without ever having to explain herself. "It's finished, Nor. You signed. This house has no place for you anymore, or the boy. As for that thing you're carrying, that's your problem now." Ilse's voice came out smooth, almost ceremonial, as though she were announcing a board decision rather than destroying a pregnant woman in front of her own child. Nor didn't answer right away. She had learned, across 6 years of marriage, that certain cruelties fed on reaction. She set down the pen, squared the papers, and breathed. Theo took a step forward and stopped himself before he got close. Shame lived on his face, but not courage, and Nor understood, in that instant, that this had always been the wound that cut deepest. He had never been the worst of men. He had simply always let the worst of them decide for him. "Theo," Nor said, without raising her voice, "do you agree with this?" She wasn't asking because she doubted the answer. She was asking so she could file it away, exactly, in the place where illusions go to die. Milo gripped the fabric tighter. The silence in the room seemed to grow teeth. Theo ran a hand through his hair, looked at his mother, then at the floor. Ilse crossed her arms, already victorious before he'd said a word. "It's better this way, Nor. You know things had become impossible between us." The sentence carried no violence in its tone, but it landed like a door slamming shut. Nor felt an old ache settle beneath her ribs, not physical, but ancient, built from 100 small humiliations swallowed at dinners, at birthdays, at family gatherings where she'd learned to smile and disappear. She remembered Theo once promising her a life away from his mother's games, promising Ilse would learn to respect her. Now he simply repeated a rehearsed line, not realizing that cowardice, dressed in a calm voice, is still cowardice. Ilse clapped twice, and 2 staff members appeared in the hallway, nervous, carrying suitcases Nor recognized instantly. Behind them, the groundskeeper came with open boxes, folded clothes and Milo's toys tangled together with old shoes, documents, photographs. A small stuffed rabbit that had belonged to Nor's late mother tumbled to the floor near the door. No one bent to pick it up. Ilse pointed toward the wet garden outside, as if evicting an unwelcome guest who had overstayed a visit. "Take it all to the curb. I don't want a single trace of her in this house by nightfall." Nor felt Milo press his face into her leg. The child didn't cry, and that hurt worse than any scream could have. Nor knelt carefully, despite the weight in her belly, and touched her son's cheek. "Look at me, sweetheart. We're going to walk out of here, not run. Nobody can take away who we are." Milo nodded, eyes brimming, trying to be brave because he watched his mother being brave. The Varick estate had always been built to intimidate: pale columns, a sweeping staircase, tall iron gates, discreet cameras, portraits of stern-faced men lining every hallway. Nor had entered that house as a bride and been received, ever since, as a polite intruder. Ilse liked to say a Kestrel could never understand Varick tradition, conveniently forgetting that Nor's own father, a quiet accountant named Elias Kestrel, had once kept that family's fortune from collapsing in a scandal no one liked to mention anymore. When the first boxes hit the wet pavement, the sound cut through the wind like a public sentence. A suitcase burst open, scattering maternity clothes across the stone path. Cars along the private road slowed, drivers pretending not to look. A security guard turned his face away, ashamed, but didn't move. Ilse watched it all from the covered porch, immaculate in her dark coat, while Theo stood behind her, small inside his expensive suit, a prisoner of a comfort he mistook for destiny. Nor walked toward the door with Milo beside her. The wind hit her the moment she stepped past the porch's shelter, plastering her thin sweater against the curve of her belly. She didn't ask for an umbrella. She didn't ask for time. She only looked at the boxes, quickly sorting what mattered: documents, medication, Milo's clothes, a folder of medical records, and then, at the bottom of a crushed box, she saw it: a scratched leather satchel that had belonged to her father. Ilse saw where Noor's eyes had landed and let out a short, cutting laugh. "Take that old thing. Your family always cared more about dead paper than real inheritance." Noor lifted the satchel with a tenderness that clashed with the brutality of the scene around her. The leather was worn thin by time, but the clasp still held firm, and she remembered, suddenly, her father once telling her that some documents sleep for years, waiting for someone's arrogance to wake them up. She hadn't understood what he meant. Not until this exact moment, standing in the rain with her whole life reduced to a handful of boxes on a stranger's curb, because inside that satchel, sealed for over a decade, was something Ilse Verick didn't know existed. Something with her own family's name written across the very first page. The rain hadn't let up by the time Ren Castellan's car pulled to the curb, headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. She stepped out without an umbrella, hair coming loose from its knot, her face tight with a fury she didn't bother to hide. She looked at the suitcases scattered across the wet stone, at Noor soaked to the skin, at Milo clinging to a bag nearly as big as he was, and she understood everything without needing a single word of explanation. "Get in the car. Now." Noor nodded, but before she climbed in she went back to the crushed box and pulled out 3 folders bound with an elastic band, hidden beneath old bedsheets. Ilse watched from the porch, already bored, with no idea she was witnessing the first tremor of her own downfall. Ren wanted to argue, to march back up those steps and say every cruel thing rising in her throat, but Noor touched her hand, asking for silence instead. Some battles began better without an audience. She settled Milo into the back seat, buckled him in, arranged the bag beside him, and breathed carefully through a tightening low in her belly. It wasn't labor, not yet, she was almost certain, but her body was protesting the brutality of the day in its own language. Ren noticed the wince and went pale. "Hospital. Now." "My place first," Noor said. "Then I make one call." Her voice came out low, but it didn't break. Before she got into the car, Noor looked back one last time at the estate. The lights were already on despite the hour, the facade gleaming under the rain like a palace with no soul left inside it. Ilse remained on the porch, composed, certain she had won. Theo stood behind her, torn between guilt and obedience, still not understanding that some doors, once closed by cowardice, don't reopen just because someone regrets it later. Ren pulled away before Ilse could get another word in. Inside the car, the smell of rain gave way to damp upholstery and old coffee. Milo finally began to cry, not loudly, but in small, cutting sobs. Noor pulled her son close, kissed his wet hair, and let him cry without asking him to be strong. Children shouldn't have to carry the pride of adults. At Ren's apartment hours later, a warm towel wrapped around Milo and a cup of tea cooling untouched in front of Noor, the small living room, cluttered with books, plants, and mismatched cushions, felt safer than any hall in the Verick estate ever had. Ren paced, furious, wanting to call the police, the press, a judge, anyone with the power to make Ilse feel even a fraction of the shame she'd handed out so freely. Noor sat at the table and opened the leather satchel that had belonged to her father, Elias Kestrel. The clasp gave a small, quiet click, almost intimate. Inside were certified copies, letters, records of old meetings, and a sealed envelope with her name written across it in her father's firm handwriting. She ran her fingers over the paper, and the grief came without asking permission. Elias had died before ever meeting Milo, but he'd left traces of protection in places no one thought to look. Noor opened the envelope and read the first lines. With every sentence, her expression shifted, less from surprise than from confirmation. Her father hadn't merely suspected the Vericks. He had known them. Ren stopped behind her. "What is that?" Noor didn't answer right away. She picked up one of the folders and found the title of the family trust tied to the Verick Fortune's core holdings. She read through clauses about conduct, protection of heirs, asset fraud, and preservation of the rights of spouses during pregnancy. The words were cold on the page, but that night they carried the warmth of justice. Ilse could throw a woman out of a house, but she couldn't throw the law out of a document signed decades earlier by men who had feared exactly the kind of woman Noor was about to become. Noor picked up her phone and called Julian Okafor. He answered on the third ring, his voice rough with surprise at seeing her number. "Noor, did something happen?" She looked at Milo asleep on the sofa, one hand curled around a small red toy car. She looked down at her own belly, at the leather satchel, at the rain streaking the window. "Something happened, Julian. Ilse threw me out of the house right after the divorce was finalized. I have my father's documents. I need you to read Clause 11. Silence answered her on the other end. Then the sound of a chair scraping back, drawers opening in a hurry. Julian knew that trust. He knew the Varick name well enough to never show surprise without reason. Nor heard pages turning, a heavy breath, another pause. When he came back on the line, his voice wasn't just an old family friend's anymore. It belonged to a lawyer standing in front of a decisive piece of evidence. "Noor, if what you're telling me can be proven, they have an enormous problem." She closed her eyes for a moment. She felt no joy. Real justice rarely arrives like a celebration, especially when it's born from humiliation. She only felt the ground that had been ripped from under her on that curb beginning to reform somewhere else. "It can be proven. I have witnesses, messages, the signed divorce, and the eviction caught on the street cameras." Julian exhaled slowly. "Then listen carefully. Under this clause, control of the assets can be suspended tonight. Ilse may have just triggered her own ruin." Noor opened her eyes. Somewhere across the city, in that same house, Ilse was likely toasting the end of an inconvenient presence, certain she had won by understanding cruelty better than anyone else. Theo was probably alone in his study, trying to convince his conscience that he'd done what was necessary. Neither of them had any idea that an old document dismissed for years as dead paper was about to rise up against the entire house, and that the first phone call to shake its foundations had already been made. Ren's apartment woke before Noor managed any real sleep. The rain had stopped, but the city stayed gray, streets shining under a thin film of water, distant horns bleeding through the closed windows. Milo lay curled on the sofa, the little red car still pressed against his chest like an anchor against the wreck of the day before. Noor stayed at the table, surrounded by folders, old copies, and her father's notes, feeling the weight of the pregnancy and the sleepless night, but refusing to let exhaustion make her decisions for her. Ren set a mug of coffee beside the documents and watched her friend in silence. Rare, for a woman who usually met the world with quick words. Noor's hair was still damp, pinned back carelessly, her face pale, her eyes steady, almost hard. There was a quiet beauty in that kind of resistance. Not the fragile beauty the Varricks had tried to tame, but a silent strength built from method and memory. Julian Okafor arrived a little after 7, wearing a rumpled jacket and carrying a black folder under one arm. He was a gray-haired man with a low voice and eyes trained to spot danger before it had a name. He greeted Ren with a brief nod and stopped in front of Noor like a man looking at the daughter of a dead friend, carrying an entire war on her shoulders. He didn't offer empty words. He pulled up a chair, opened his own files, and said he needed to check dates, signatures, records, witnesses. Noor slid the leather satchel toward him. Julian touched it with something like reverence, as if he weren't holding old leather but the last unfinished conversation with a man who never did anything by accident. Inside were the founding documents of the Varick family trust, letters between Elias and the family patriarch, Corwin Varick, and a set of amendments written in precise, deliberate language. Julian read every page with his brow furrowed, and with each passing minute his expression turned more startled, more grave. "Your father knew Ilse would try to control everything one day," Julian said. "He didn't write these clauses for elegance. He wrote them like a man building a wall." Noor rested a hand on her belly, feeling a light pressure, and looked over at Milo, still asleep. "He never told me. He knew I'd try to stop my own life from following his path." "Elias trusted you," Julian said. But he also knew your tendency to protect people who didn't deserve it. The sentence cut through her with painful precision. The clause, the 11th, stated that any attempt to abandon, coerce, or harm a pregnant spouse connected to the direct line of succession would immediately suspend the administrative authority of the family's trustees. The 12th established that, as long as a vulnerable minor heir existed, an independent board could transfer temporary custody of the estate to a legal representative named in a prior document. Buried in the papers, Nor found a letter from Corwin Varric naming Elias Kestrel, and, in his absence, his daughter Nor, as technical guardian of the minor heir's interests. Wren let out a breath like she'd been struck. So they threw out the one person who could freeze their money. Julian looked up over his glasses. Not just freeze it. If we can prove the eviction, the coercion during the divorce, and the exposure of the children, we can request suspension of authority, an audit, and emergency protection of the assets. Nor didn't smile. The news carried weight but also cost. For every document, there would be a predictable reaction from Ilsa, and women like her didn't fall without trying to drag someone down with them. Across the city, the Varric estate woke under a false calm. Ilsa sat at the head of a long table, drinking coffee from white porcelain, like a queen presiding over invisible subjects. Theo appeared late, dark circles under his eyes, his tie loosely knotted. She noticed his condition and felt irritation, not compassion. To Ilsa, guilt was a luxury for people without responsibilities. She scrolled a financial paper on her tablet and remarked that life would return to normal the moment Nor understood her own insignificance. Theo tried to drink his coffee, but his hand trembled. The image of Milo flinching away from his touch kept returning, merciless. "Mother, maybe we went too far yesterday." Ilsa lowered her cup slowly. What went too far was letting that woman stay in this house as long as she did. You needed to cut ties. Theo stared at the long table, set for a family that never gathered, warm for no one. "She's pregnant." Ilsa pressed her lips together. Pregnancy doesn't turn opportunism into virtue. She'd use that child to tie herself to us forever. The house phone rang before Theo could answer. The butler took the call in the hallway and returned with a rigid expression. It was the family's primary bank, requesting confirmation on a preventive notice received that morning. Ilsa took the phone with her usual impatience, expecting to resolve it with her customary authority, but the manager informed her that several transactions linked to the family trust had been suspended pending documentation review. The silence that settled over the room was heavy enough that Theo looked up for the first time. "What trust?" he asked. Ilsa ended the call without saying goodbye and set the phone down with exaggerated care. Inside her, an old memory stirred, unwelcome. Corwin Varric, her late father-in-law, had once spoken of family protection, of moral limits, of keeping the fortune from ever being turned against innocent blood. Ilsa had always dismissed that sentimentality, certain that sleeping documents didn't survive time or influence. And yet the word suspension kept vibrating in her ears like a trapped insect. At Wren's apartment, Nor listened as Julian laid out the next steps, making notes on a blank sheet of paper. First, they needed to preserve the street camera footage before the estate could erase its internal records. Second, they needed statements from staff who had witnessed the eviction. Third, they had to file an emergency motion before Ilsa could move assets into shell accounts. Julian spoke with total objectivity, but he kept glancing at Nor's pale face, worried for both her and the child not yet born. "You need to see a doctor today?" he said. Nor raised her eyes. "I need legal security first." Wren slapped the table lightly, indignant. "You need both. I'm booking the appointment, and you're not arguing." Nor held her gaze for a moment, and for the first time since the night before, a very human exhaustion slipped through the cracks. "Fine. But Julian files the motion before noon." Julian agreed, recognizing in her the same fire Elias used to carry whenever injustice tried to hide behind a respectable face. While Wren took Milo to change into dry clothes, Nor opened her father's letter. The firm handwriting seemed to bring his voice back, calm, severe. Elias wrote that a fortune without conscience became a weapon, and that the Varrics had men capable of building empires, but also women and heirs capable of mistaking command for ownership of souls. He asked Noor never to use this information out of pride, only for protection. When she finished reading, she had to close her eyes to keep the grief from taking over. Milo appeared in the doorway, hair messy, wearing a borrowed t-shirt far too big for him. "Are we going back home, Mommy?" The question tore through the room with terrible simplicity. Noor pulled her son close, settling him carefully onto her lap despite the weight of her belly. "We're going to find a home where no one can ever put us outside again." Milo thought about it. "Really? Will Daddy live there too?" Ren looked away. Noor took a slow breath before answering. "Your dad is going to need to learn how to be a father before he can live near your heart again." Milo didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to rest his head against her shoulder. Julian watched the exchange with the quiet recognition of a man who knew some answers didn't belong to courtrooms. In that moment, the fight stopped being only about shares, clauses, and control of assets. It became about teaching a child that love should never come wrapped in humiliation, and that protection was never something to beg for. By late afternoon, the first legal notice had already reached the Varick estate's front gate, hand-delivered by courier, demanding an emergency hearing before the family trust's independent board. Ilse read the letterhead once, twice, her jaw tightening with every word, because at the bottom of the page, beside Julian Okafor's signature, was a second name she hadn't expected to see so soon, her own late father-in-law's seal of authorization, resurrected from a drawer she had assumed would stay shut forever. The emergency session was called for 9 the next morning on the top floor of Varick Tower, where glass walls made the city look distant and obedient. Noor arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a dark blue blazer Ren had adjusted the night before with a discreet ribbon to make room for the pregnancy. Milo stayed behind with Ren, shielded from cameras and the kind of adults who mistake cruelty for tradition. Julian walked beside her carrying a rigid folder, while 2 independent auditors followed with cases and the expressions of people who preferred facts to family names. In the lobby, employees pretended to focus on their screens, but their eyes tracked Noor in silence. Some had seen her at company events, always elegant, always quiet, treated by Ilse as an accessory to Theo. Others had already heard about the eviction, the smear piece that ran 2 days earlier calling her an opportunist, the whispers that she wanted to destroy jobs. Now they watched a pregnant woman cross the building without an entourage, without tears, without spectacle. There was a stillness in her that didn't ask for sympathy. It only asked for room for the truth to breathe. Ilse was already seated when Noor entered, claiming the center of the table though the summons gave her no formal authority to preside. She wore a wine-colored dress, immaculate, and a strand of pearls that had belonged to her own mother-in-law, as if invoking ancestors to legitimize her command. Theo sat to her right, pale, a closed folder in front of him. Corwin's old lieutenant, Desmond Farrow, occupied a chair further off, avoiding eye contact with both women. The board members murmured among themselves, uneasy with the sense that a dynasty had been called in to be examined. Noor didn't fight for the head of the table. She sat where the board secretary indicated, folded her hands, and waited. Ilse read the calm as provocation. "I hope everyone understands we're here because of an emotional, opportunistic attempt at interfering with this family's assets." Noor said nothing. Julian simply asked that the statement be entered into the record. The secretary, a thin man with a gray mustache, looked up in surprise and began typing. From that moment, every word stopped being theater and became documentation. The board chair, Adrian Voss, opened the session in a tense voice, stating the meeting would review possible violations of the Varick Family Trust, risk to minor heirs, indications of administrative fraud, and the need for protective measures. Ilse tried to interrupt on the second sentence, arguing the agenda was too broad and intruded on family matters. Adrian answered that the trust had tied family and fortune together by the founder's explicit intent. The reply carried no warmth, but it carried weight. Noor saw a flash of irritation cross her former mother-in-law's face. Julian began the presentation without theatrics. On the screen appeared a timeline: the divorce signing, the eviction, the forced removal of belongings, Milo standing in the rain, the bank's suspension notice, Ilse's attempt to alter custody arrangements. Each event came with a timestamp, a document, a source. Ilse kept a look of contempt through the first minutes, but her fingers tightened around her pen. When the footage from the street camera appeared, silent, shaky, devastating, the room went still. No shouting in the video, no soundtrack, no commentary. Just suitcases hitting stone, maternity clothes scattered on wet pavement, a small boy clutching a bag too big for him, and a pregnant woman gathering what mattered without bending. One board member looked away, ashamed. Theo stared at the screen as though watching not the past, but the exact portrait of his own failure. Ilse, Noor said, speaking for the first time, if you're saying the scene was staged, please tell the board on the record who ordered the staff to put my belongings on the curb. The question was too simple to allow an elegant escape. Ilse's smile turned thin. The house needed to be reorganized after the divorce. Reorganized, Noor repeated, without hostility, in the rain, with a child present, hours after a signing your lawyer's call consensual. Julian asked that the answer be recorded too. The secretary typed faster. Theo shifted in his seat, and Ilse noticed a familiar order disguised as maternal instinct. He lowered his eyes, but not the way he used to. This time the shame had a direction. Adrian requested a reading of Clause 11. An outside counsel, retained by the board and not the family, read aloud the passage concerning suspension of authority in cases of coercion, abandonment, or deliberate harm against a pregnant spouse tied to the line of succession. Words written decades earlier seemed to have waited precisely for this morning. Ilse attacked the text. She said Corwin had been sentimental, that he never imagined a former daughter-in-law using pregnancy as a legal shield. Julian answered before Noor needed to. The clause doesn't only protect the pregnancy. It protects the integrity of the heirs, and it prevents administrators from using economic power to crush dependents. Noor's unborn child, her son, and the stability of this trust are legally inseparable in this situation. One of the auditors added that preliminary records suggested recent transfers had been structured to circumvent those very protections before the eviction took place. That sentence shifted the entire room. Until then, some board members had still clung to the hope of treating this as a private family matter. Fraud belonged to a different territory altogether. Julian opened the second folder. Shell consulting firms with no real operations. Transfers to companies tied to Ilse's relatives. Properties sold below market value and quietly repurchased through intermediaries. Desmond began to sweat. Ilse kept her composure, but Noor watched the exact moment her arrogance stopped being armor and became desperate calculation. This is a collection of documents pulled out of context, Ilse said. Family businesses have complex structures. Noor didn't need to raise her voice. I agree. That's why I brought independent auditors, comparative statements, and internal messages showing the intent to move trust assets before the divorce was finalized. The screen displayed a message from one of Ilse's assistants, mentioning the need to remove Noor from Theo's sphere of influence before the pregnancy became a succession problem. The silence that followed wasn't embarrassed anymore. It was dangerous. Theo raised his head slowly. He recognized the assistant's name, the format of the messages, the tone of urgency he'd seen circulate so many times in decisions he signed without reading. Ilse spoke before he could. Theo had nothing to do with these technical matters. It was formality. Noor looked at her former husband, not with tenderness, not with hatred, but with the severity of someone offering one last chance at honesty. Theo, you signed authorizations tied to these companies. Did you know what they were for? The question placed him at the center of the table, a place he had never learned to occupy alone. Ilse began answering for him, but Adrian cut her off. The board needed to hear it directly from him. Theo exhaled, opened the folder in front of him, and pulled out crumpled pages, copies Desmond had handed him in the dead of night, unable to carry the weight alone any longer. I signed. In many cases, I signed without proper review, trusting my mother and the internal reports. I didn't know everything, but that doesn't excuse me. I also know now that Noor put personal savings into this company during the liquidity crisis 3 years ago, to protect payroll, and that fact was buried. The revelation landed on the room with a different kind of weight. Several board members exchanged glances, remembering old presentations where Ilse had been credited as the one who'd saved the company's liquidity. Ilse turned to her son with a terrible slowness. "You chose a spectacularly poor moment to discover honesty." Theo's face went pale, but this time he didn't retreat. "Maybe the right moment was years ago. I missed it. I'm not going to miss this one." Desmond, feeling the ground disappear beneath him, asked to speak. Ilse shot him a look of open threat, but he had already calculated that silence would drag him down with her. He admitted that certain transactions had been designed to preserve voting control and liquidity outside the trust's reach, under Ilse's direct instruction. He said Theo rarely asked questions, which made it easier. He confirmed that internal records of Noor's contribution had been reclassified to obscure its origin. Ilse stood. "This is a conspiracy. A weak son, a cowardly director, and a bitter woman trying to destroy an entire family's legacy." Noor rose too, more slowly, one hand braced against the table. Her belly stood as living proof of the future Ilse had tried to treat as an inconvenience. "You mistake family for obedience, and legacy for ownership. No one in this room is destroying the Varick name. We're stopping you from using that name to shield decisions that would shame even the people you claim to honor." Her voice didn't shake. Adrian called for order, but no one else spoke. The bank representatives requested a 10-minute recess to confer. No one left the room. The pause filled instead with quiet phone calls, hurried typed messages, eyes that wouldn't meet. Noor sat back down, feeling a light pull in her back. Julian leaned in, concerned, but she waved him off gently. When the session resumed, Adrian read the emergency resolution aloud. Immediate suspension of Ilse Varick from any administrative role tied to the trust. Provisional removal of Theo Varick from executive leadership pending review of his signatures. Appointment of an external audit. Mandatory preservation of all records. And temporary transfer of guardianship over the minor heir's interests to Noor Kestrel, in accordance with the original trust instrument. The word temporary did nothing to soften the impact. Ilse let out an incredulous laugh, but no one echoed it. For the first time, the Empire did not answer to her command. The vote proceeded name by name. The first board member approved. The second hesitated, glanced at Ilse, and approved anyway. The third tried to abstain, but outside counsel explained that abstention, given the evidence, could be read as fiduciary neglect. He approved in a low voice. One by one, the votes accumulated, not from sudden courage, but from the instinct of people unwilling to be caught on the wrong side of a documented record. Noor understood that weakness for what it was and didn't mistake it for virtue. Still, justice sometimes advanced on nothing more than the self-preservation of the fearful. Ilse slammed a hand on the table. "None of you know how to run this without me. You'll watch contracts collapse, creditors flee, shareholders panic." Noor answered before security could be called. "You spent years making sure everyone believed that. Which is exactly why this transition will be technical, audited, and transparent. This company doesn't belong to your fear. It belongs to a network of people, obligations, and histories that will survive far better without being held hostage." Ilse looked at her with a raw hatred, stripped of every polished layer, and in that look she admitted everything she would never say aloud. The gavel came down. The room began to empty in stunned, careful silence. But as the board members filed out and the enormity of what had just happened settled over the tower's glass walls, one final piece of paper remained on the table, unopened, addressed not to Ilse, not to Theo, but to Noor herself, in handwriting that made Julian go completely still the moment he recognized it: Corwin Varick's. Julian didn't touch the envelope right away. He simply stared at Corwin Varick's handwriting, the way a man stares at a door he never expected to see open again. The room had mostly cleared, board members filing out in stiff, uneasy silence, Desmond Farrow already gone, escorted toward an exit interview he clearly hadn't planned for. Theo lingered near the window, watching the street below where, 2 days earlier, his own son had stood in the rain holding a bag too heavy for his arms. "Noor," Julian said quietly, "this is addressed to you. Not to the board. To you, specifically." Noor took the envelope with the same careful hands she'd used on her father's satchel. The paper was old, the seal cracked from age, and for a moment she felt the strange vertigo of being handed a message from a dead man she had never once spoken to as an equal, only ever as an intimidated daughter-in-law standing at the edges of his dinner table. She opened it there, at the emptying boardroom table, because some things could not wait for privacy. Inside was a single page, dated 11 years earlier, written in Corwin's blunt, unadorned hand. He wrote that he had grown suspicious of his own wife's ambitions long before his health failed him, that Ilse had, on more than one occasion, pressured him while he was already weakened by illness to alter the trust in her favor, cutting out safeguards he'd built specifically to protect future spouses and children from being used as leverage. He had refused. And knowing Ilse would not simply accept that refusal and move on, he had asked Elias Kestrel, Nor's father, his own quiet, trusted accountant, to record everything. Every conversation. Every threat dressed as concern. Nor's breath caught. Her father hadn't only protected the trust from a distance. He had stood directly between Corwin and Ilse, absorbing pressure meant for a dying man, and had never once told her. "There's more," Julian said, nodding toward a line further down the page. "Corwin says the records aren't with the trust documents. He says Elias kept a duplicate set somewhere separate, insurance, in case the originals were ever tampered with." Nor read the final paragraph twice. Corwin had written an address, not the estate, not the tower, but an old storage facility on the industrial edge of the city, a property still technically held under a defunct subsidiary of the Varick Holdings. If anything ever happened to the founding documents, he wrote, that was where the truth would be waiting. Wren, who had come to collect Nor after the session ended, read the last line over her shoulder and went very still. "You're not seriously going there today?" "I have to," Nor said, "before Ilse realizes this letter exists." But Ilse already knew something had shifted. She'd left the tower in silence, refusing to speak to reporters gathered outside the glass doors, refusing even to look at Theo as she passed him. In the car, alone, she called the one person she still trusted enough to phone directly, her late husband's former personal attorney, a man long retired, who had drafted half the confidential agreements the Varick family had buried over 3 decades. She didn't mention the letter. She didn't know it existed yet. She only said, in a voice stripped of its usual command, "I need to know what else Corwin might have hidden from me before he died." There was a long pause on the line. Then the old attorney said something that made Ilse's hand tighten around the phone. "Ilse, if he wrote anything down about the accountant, about Kestrel, burn it before anyone else reads it. That man knew everything." By the time Nor arrived at the storage facility with Julian and one of the independent auditors, the winter light had turned thin and gray, the kind of light that made even ordinary buildings look abandoned. The gate was chained shut with a lock newer than the rust around it. Odd, for a property the company's own records listed as inactive for nearly a decade. A locksmith Julian had called ahead cut through the chain, and the sound of metal snapping echoed across the empty lot like something waking up. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, motor oil, and damp concrete. Shelves lined the walls under dust-heavy tarps. Numbered boxes sat stacked in uneven towers. In a small office at the back, a locked filing cabinet waited, its drawers stiff with age. Nor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Corwin wouldn't have sent her here for nothing. The auditor photographed everything methodically before anyone touched a single box. Dates, seals, reference codes. In the third drawer of the cabinet, Julian found a red folder with Elias Kestrel's name typed across the tab, and beneath it, in her father's own handwriting, a single line. "For Nor, if the day ever comes." Her hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. Inside were transcripts, actual transcripts, typed and dated, of conversations Elias had documented word for word at Corwin's request. Conversations in which Ilse had pressed a dying man to strip protections from his own grandchildren's inheritance. Conversations in which she discussed, with chilling calm, ways to ensure that any future daughter-in-law would have no legal standing strong enough to challenge her. And near the bottom of the folder, something Nor hadn't expected at all. A photograph, decades old, of Ilse standing beside a man who was not Corwin, not any Varick, in front of a small provincial courthouse, with a date stamped in the corner that placed it years before her marriage into the family. Julian went still reading the note clipped to the photograph in Elias's handwriting. He looked up at Noor with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not caution, not calculation, but something closer to alarm. "Noor," he said slowly, "I don't think this is just about fraud anymore. I think your father found something about who Ilse Varick actually was before she became a Varick at all, and I think it's the reason she spent 30 years making sure no one ever asked." Behind them, the auditor's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the tower. Ilse had just walked into the building unannounced, demanding access to the very same storage facility's records, and she was already on her way. Noor barely had time to slide the folder into her bag before headlights swept across the gravel outside. Ilse's car came to a stop hard enough to skid on the wet ground, and she stepped out already speaking, already commanding, as though the building itself still answered to her. "This facility belongs to a Varick subsidiary. You have no right to be in here without board authorization." Julian stepped forward, calm, holding up the emergency order Adrian Voss had signed that morning. The board authorized a full audit of all Varick-linked properties. This one included. "You're welcome to call Adrian yourself." Ilse's eyes moved past him, landing on the red folder half visible in Noor's bag, and something in her face changed, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a woman watching the last locked door in her life swing open in front of witnesses. "Whatever you think you found in here means nothing. Old men keep old grudges. That doesn't make them true." "Then you won't mind explaining the photograph," Noor said quietly. For the first time since the divorce papers had been signed, Ilse Varick had nothing rehearsed to say. The silence stretched long enough that even the auditor stopped writing. Then Ilse turned, walked back to her car without another word, and drove away, not toward the tower, not toward the estate, but toward something only she understood, leaving Theo, when he arrived 20 minutes later out of breath and confused, to find only Noor, Julian, and a locksmith standing in an empty lot in the fading light. What came out over the following weeks unfolded slowly, the way real consequences usually do, not in a single dramatic courtroom moment, but in quiet phone calls, forwarded records, and a private meeting between Julian and the board's outside counsel that lasted 4 hours. The photograph, the transcripts, and a subsequent records search confirmed what Elias Kestrel had apparently suspected decades earlier: Ilse's claim to a prominent, respected family history, the very lineage she'd used for 30 years to justify her authority over the Varicks, had been built on a name that was never legally hers to begin with. It didn't erase what she'd built since. But it meant every argument she'd ever made about tradition, about bloodline, about who deserved to belong in that house, had been resting on a foundation she herself had invented. She did not go to prison. The fraud case moved forward on its own separate track: asset misappropriation, falsified internal records, attempted coercion documented in her own assistant's messages, and ended, eventually, in a settlement that stripped her of any remaining claim to the trust and required restitution paid quietly, without fanfare, into the very fund the board had frozen the day of the hearing. Nor never asked for more than that. She hadn't wanted Ilse's ruin. She had wanted the truth to stop being something people were afraid to say out loud. Theo visited Milo on a fixed schedule after that, always in neutral places at first. Milo, cautious, once asked his father if he'd just stand there again if someone yelled. Theo didn't promise heroics. He said only that he was learning not to stay silent. Noor listened from a distance, allowing the closeness to build without handing her son a comfortable lie. Between her and Theo there remained a careful, guarded respect, built from clear boundaries. The old love hadn't died in a single day, but it no longer governed anything. In its place grew something calmer, more honest than any hurried reconciliation could have been. The baby was born on a clear morning, when winter had just begun loosening its grip. Noor felt the first pains beside Ren, in the same small apartment that had taken her in the night of the eviction. Julian arrived at the hospital with simple flowers. Theo waited in the hallway with Milo. Ren held Noor's hand until the child came into the world. A girl, small and furious with life, crying with a strength that startled even the nurses. Noor named her Iris, because after so much shadow, that name felt like a promise that didn't need to shout. When Milo was allowed into the room and saw his sister, he approached on the tips of his toes, as if standing before something sacred, and asked if Iris had been thrown out of the old house too. Nor laughed through her exhaustion and pulled him close. No, sweetheart. Iris arrived exactly when we were already building a new one. A few months later, Noor signed the papers for a new home, not a mansion, though it had a garden, wide windows, and enough room for 2 children to run without ever fearing a door slammed shut in pride. Ren said the house felt like it was breathing. Julian, seeing an old photograph of Elias Kestrel on a shelf, went quiet for a moment before nodding, as if satisfied the man's work had finally found its resting place. On the afternoon, she formally stepped down from her temporary guardianship of the trust, declining a permanent seat, recommending an independent executive to lead the company's restructuring instead. Noor drove past the old Varick estate with Milo and baby Iris in the back seat. She didn't go in. She only slowed as they passed the gate. Milo recognized the house and went quiet for a moment. "Does that house still tell us what to do?" he asked. Noor looked at the pale columns, the flawless windows, and felt neither fear nor longing. "Only memory. Houses only rule us," she said, "when we still believe there's no way out of them." That evening, in her own garden, she watched Milo chase a ball across the grass while Iris slept in her stroller beneath a young tree. The sky held the quiet color of a day that no longer needed to prove anything. Ren would come for dinner. Julian would bring documents Noor would probably read anyway, no matter how many times she swore she was resting. And Theo would collect Milo on Saturday, with the patience of a man learning that trust has to be rebuilt slowly, never demanded. Life went on, imperfect, but it belonged now to choices made honestly. Noor closed her eyes and let herself remember the rain on the pavement, the suitcases spilling open, Ilse's cold laughter, Milo's small hand gripping her bag too tightly. The memory no longer diminished her. It was simply the starting point of a woman who had lost her home, her marriage, and every illusion in a single afternoon, and had refused to lose herself along with them. When she opened her eyes, she saw Iris stir, Milo laugh, and the light move gently through the new leaves above them. And she understood, finally, that the deepest justice was never watching your enemies fall. It was standing whole, long after the fall was over.